panelist, Joesph Ozias, is a PhD candidate in English at the University of Cincinnati, where he studies Jewish American literature, humor, and film. His work has been published or is soon to be published in Philip Roth's Studies, Milos, and the John Updike Review. He's received various awards, including the Judith Uross Lee Grant from the American Humor Studies Association and the Siegel McDaniel Award from the Philip Roth Society. He teaches courses such as Jews in American Film, World Literature, American Literature, and more.
All right. Well, so my paper today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Heartbreak Kid. The way I've structured this presentation, I'm working on a much larger article. So today I want to focus on one character, the changes in particular, and I'll briefly touch on the other. That way we have, enough time here. All right. So Elaine May's 1972 film, The Heartbreak Kid, was a success, garnering a handful of award nominations. Though the film was initially well received and now a cult hit, it certainly has its flaws. Audiences today might be appalled at the main character Lenny's behavior as he takes his wife Lila on a honeymoon and promptly abandons her in the hotel room to chase after another woman, Kelly, and eventually marry her instead. The initial film was telling a rather complicated story about Jewishness, one of rejecting and accepting a heritage, a Jewish lead chasing after a shiksa, non-Jewish, waspish woman, a cautionary tale of heartbreak and the failings of ceaselessly chasing after satisfaction. But Lenny was undoubtedly mean, sexist, and a little creepy. While the film does not ask the audience to side with Lenny, Bobby and Peter Farrelly feared this might be the case when remaking the film in 2007, 35 years later. In an effort to allow the audience to go with their instinct to side with now Ben Stiller's version of the character and make it a more traditional romantic comedy, they stripped the story of all of its nuance. They renamed him Eddie and removed the Jewish themes, eliminated all aspects of Lenny's character that made him complex, and worse, they made his wife, Lila, instead of a kind, gentle, innocent victim of Lenny's choices, into a violent maniac that pushes him to make those choices. These changes speak to shifting cultural values and some values, particularly the film's treatment of women, that had not shifted all that much. So in this presentation, I'm going to examine what each film brings to the table in hopes of understanding what that original film is trying to say and why altering it to this extent leaves the audience wondering, among other things, where all the nuance went. If you look into reviews of the initial film, you'll find many reflecting on the complex nature of the characters in the story. Some will complain about the sexism, others will laud Elaine May as a visionary, some do both, but these complaints tend to miss the point of Lenny's character, at least as I see it. Since the film is presented in two halves, the first where Lenny is on a honeymoon with Lila, and the second when Lenny is chasing Kelly after the honeymoon. Reviews tended to follow suit, either focusing on Lenny and Lila or Lenny and Kelly as a pairing. Reviews like Joss Larson's try to shift blame away from Lenny and turns his sights to Kelly. He says, Kelly is guilelessly diabolical, allowing her mere presence to goad Lenny into becoming his worst self. Simran Hans, to present a different mode, places some blame on Lila, instead, saying, quote, May cast her own daughter as the preening Lila, and Berlin dispenses with her own vanity, leaning into the physical comedy of the role. She's not afraid to get egg on her face, literally, or to play up the body horror of sunburn, surfacing from an afternoon on the sun loungers as red as a freshly boiled lobster. She might be read as the shrill embodiment of the Jewish director's own neuroses about being passed over for a cool secular blonde, end quote. I think Caitlin Hart says it best, though, when she implies that there could have been a bit of a misunderstanding here. The humor in the film is tough for some to swallow, and at the time, quote, Jewish comedy was already moving to the center of popular culture, and as New Hollywood took hold, more Jewish comedians, actors, writers, and directors were telling Jewish stories on screen, end quote. While the trend was toward growth, toward abundance, audiences were still unsure and wary of these kinds of stories, this kind of complicated humor. And that uncertainty, I think, informs much of the decision-making in 2007, though decades later, as Bobby and Peter Farrelly sat down to remake the film. Because the story could be read as rather mean-spirited, a man breaking up with his wife on their honeymoon to chase a new woman is, of course, not a great look. They tried to switch things up a bit for the new generation of audiences, and in doing so, they ruined the two main characters, Lenny and Lila. Though today, like I mentioned, I'll be focusing on Lenny, I want to start by briefly discussing Lila for some context. Lila in the initial film is a kind-hearted woman who comes off as perhaps a little clingy. That's her kind of biggest flaw. She loves Lenny and repeatedly makes jokes about how they'll turn out in 40 to 50 years, which starts to get on Lenny's nerves. The idea of being trapped for his entire life begins to suffocate him. They have sex and she asks too many questions about whether he liked it or not. She's flirtatious when he doesn't want it, but reserved when he's ready. The relationship fallout is a bit of a tragedy because it feels like they simply weren't meant to be. Nothing really lines up for the two of them. When Lenny begins chasing another woman, we hate him for his actions, but sort of understand that he likely rushed his relationship and is now regretting it. In the remake, this nuance couldn't stand. So what do? They make Lila awful. She hits Lenny, who's now Eddie. She screams at him. She's gross. The trailer literally features her farting multiple times as if to tell the audience before they even see the movie, it's okay to root for him. And though I will not be breaking down every single change to Lila's character here, as I promised, I'd be remiss not to tell you that in a Marvel-style after-credits scene, we find out that Lila, after divorcing Ben Stiller's protagonist, has been having sex with a donkey. And yes, just as you imagined this in your head just now, after they do the deed, they pan over to a donkey in a robe smoking a cigarette. No, I assure you, I'm not kidding. That is how they end this movie, which is very bizarre if you've seen the original, right? But while I could go on for pages upon pages about these awful changes to Lila, I think Lenny's changes are the most damning, even if they're far more subtle than those kind of radical, insane changes to Lila. While Lila seems changed in an effort to soften the mean-spirited nature of the plot, and in doing so, ironically makes it mean-spirited in a different way, the changes to Lenny seem to be about a different fear, and it all begins with his name, which I mentioned in the opening. Lenny is now Eddie. The Farrellys cast Ben Stiller to play the lead, and yet have stripped him of all of his Jewish identity. His names, his mannerisms, all entirely different. Leaving Lila and chasing Kelly is no longer a subtle Jewish story, it's one devoid of Jewishness completely. In May's film, Lenny and Lila are wed off the bat in a very overtly Jewish wedding. It ends in breaking the glass, shouting Mazel Tov, but their marriage is faced with everything but good luck. As Lenny falls in love with Kelly, May lets visual storytelling add extra weight to the narrative. Kelly's hair is different from Lila's. Her mannerisms are calm and mysterious. She appears as Lila's opposite. But Lenny is not just chasing someone new or exciting. He's running from a traditional Jewish woman and chasing a traditional Christian one in her stead. Kelly is the daughter of a rich white man, which leads Lenny on a wild ride of lies and unearned charisma, trying to convince him that he's smart, lying about understanding the news during small talk for starters. As things escalate, the film culminates in Lenny turning down Kelly's father's offer of $20,000 to leave her alone, with a jump cut to the wedding, a traditional Christian wedding to boot. The final image of the film is Lenny struggling to fit in with others at the wedding, his wife walking away, and Lenny sitting on a couch all alone, looking on as if he hadn't achieved anything. These themes of religion and class and even sociopathic levels of boredom from Lenny vanish in the remake. Ben Stiller's Eddie is in the right to the entire film. He is leaving what they have cast as a really horrible person and chasing down somebody who seems better in every way. But since the remake, and that's as complicated as it gets. Well, on a character level, anyway, that's as complicated as it gets, because since the remake has stripped Eddie of all nuance and complexity, making the story a simple boy loves girl, boy gets girl, they realized they needed to do something. Since nobody is overtly Jewish, there's no subtle narrative about a Jewish man leaving a Jewish woman. Since nobody is rich, nobody poor, there's no class struggle. To try and breathe life into a now boring plot, the Farrellys add a second twist. When Eddie chases down Kelly, who's now called Miranda, he discovers that after leaving Mexico, she married her boyfriend because she was angry with him for lying about being married in the first place. When Eddie tries to win her back, he ends up going back to Mexico himself all alone. So this is all new plot for the remake. This little daytime soap opera twist still wasn't enough, though, because Miranda in the end flies back to Mexico, breaking things off with her husband to chase down Eddie now, who has married someone he met in Mexico. The film proper, before that end credit scene, ends with Ben Stiller cursing at his luck, and then it ends. This sort of recurring problem motif from the original, where Lenny finds himself in the same position he started, is brought back, but entirely differently. Eddie is sure he's back to where he started, married to someone who he doesn't love, but wanting to marry Miranda instead. The cyclical nature of the story on its own wasn't what made it interesting, though. It was who Lenny was with. Not simply that he still wanted to be with Kelly/Miranda. The fact that he actually succeeded in his goal and yet was still miserable was the point. Not that he was doomed by the universe to repeat himself. So why look further at these two films? Why investigate this more? Well, these revisions to the source material do a couple of things. They, as I've argued, kind of essentially erased all the Jewish elements of the story, rewriting one of the key formative Jewish films in the 70s into a standard rom-com. In addition, they have sacrificed the interesting elements of both the leads in favor of simplifying the morality. Lenny is good, Lila is bad. When in the original film, Lila was innocent and Lenny was bad, this all leads me to wonder why these changes were made specifically. I mean, I understand the goal, of course, and I can see the intention, but why was this precisely how it all played out? Why couldn't Lila also want out of the marriage? This could have been an interesting element to both characters where they agree and move on from each other. It still ruins the idea of the original film, mind you, but it accomplishes the goal of simplifying the moral conundrum without throwing Lila under the bus. Why not just keep Lenny's name? There's no reason to change it at all. It only adds fuel to this sort of removal of Jewish themes fire. And on that note, why eliminate these Jewish themes in the first place? The idea was to not make the story about a Jewish man chasing after a Christian woman, which is a tired trope by 2007. Then the film's goal could be accomplished by just making Lenny's new romantic subject not a Christian woman. Lenny can still be Jewish and it wouldn't ruin the remake's already bland script. So while I'm certainly interested in the sexism present and the whitewashing of Jewish characters, I think the biggest crime is simply that the film has no nuance anymore. There's an overwhelming trend in the film industry to simplify, to make morally unambiguous characters. I often think about Game of Thrones when I bring this topic up. The show was praised for its complexity, its surprising twists and turns, its realism, the fact that good people make bad choices and bad people can do good things. But as the show wrapped up, fans were really angry that a lot of the good characters made bad choices still. They wanted their good characters to make good choices, to win and survive. And if I could add a footnote here, I'd say that, of course, there were actual pacing and writing issues in the final season, but the takeaway for, big studios, for filmmakers, would be the same as the Farrellys. They wouldn't think that this was not well received because the writing wasn't very strong. They would think it wasn't well received because nobody wants their good characters to do bad things. And they'd only be a little wrong with that. This trend has proven true since the early 2000s. People want to understand the characters, and the quick and dirty way to do that is to make them bland and have them do nothing wrong. Even films and shows that seem to challenge this trend, like the TV show You, for example, ends up falling into the same trap. Bad people, bad actions, good people, good actions. Characters like Lenny, who we might want to root for, but still does horrible things, don't fit so neatly into these categories. Even if you think he fits squarely into the bad category, he's really funny throughout the film. And this is a complication that the Farrellys couldn't risk including. So what is the takeaway and what can we learn? I think the troubling part of examining this remake is that it's hard to look back on it almost 20 years later and realize that some of these trends seem to still hold now. I will say that I'm hopeful that the surge of TV and streaming has sort of opened the door to so many different kinds of stories, rather than withholding space from the more nuanced, complex stories, and even more specifically Jewish ones or stories about women that respect women. These other kind of whitewashed, bland stories just also exist separately. There's not as much encroaching on the territory. The death of movie theaters also brought with it many concerns about the state of cinema, but the rise of streaming has actually injected some of that nuance back into what we watch. One such example is the recent adaptation of Fleischman is in Trouble. Taffy Brodesser Akner's novel turned limited series is all about moral ambiguity. A Jewish man and woman get a divorce and it seems cut and dry, kind of in favor of the man, but by the end it's discovered that there was a lot more to this story, and that he was, whether intentionally or not, dismissing his wife's real struggles. The lead actress, Lizzie Kaplan, in a wonderful interview, called the story a Trojan horse of a woman's story. And that imagery, I think, says it all, right? She goes on to say that men and even women would not have been interested in this story as it ends up being told if that's how it was advertised. The fact that a story like this exists now literally seems to reject the remake of the Heartbreak Kid's entire premise, would indicate that recently this disturbing trend that the Fairleys embody has started to fade. But since a story like this is Trojan horsed to the audience, this does point to a resistance to this change on the part of the viewer. Liking a film of the 2007 remake of The Heartbreak Kid would be easy, but admiring the original and lamenting the loss of challenging material that makes you question your own biases is hard. To think that the Fairleys looked at the script and could not discover any way to bring this story into the 21st century other than saying yes to a new Lenny and no to Nuance is rather depressing. But it makes for an interesting, if frustrating case study, and one, especially as new shows and films arise that challenge the trend, worth much more discussion in the coming years. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Joesph. Okay, our next two panelists, Joseph D. Martin is Assistant Professor of Spanish at Tennessee Tech University. His research interests encompass the literature and cultures of the U.S.-Mexico borderlands, with emphasis on the role of masculinity. His publications have appeared in edited volumes such as Nasty Women and Bad Hombres, Gender and Race in the 2016 U.S. presidential election, as well as The Culture and Politics of Populist Masculinities. And his co-presenter, Joesph D. Percorelli, is Associate Professor of Portuguese and Spanish at the University of North Georgia. His research interests include the perception and depiction of immigrants in Brazilian literature, as well as the literature of the Italian diaspora. His essays appear in Alter Italy and Italica. Joesph also contributed what sounds like a fascinating translation of two poems in Raíces, Brazilian Women Poets in Translation in 2022.
Our presentation is titled, I Am the Golden God, Deconstructing White Urban Masculinity, and It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. In the United States, questions of masculinity have long informed pop culture and media discourse and the products that emerge from both. The popular FXX program, It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, has compelled viewers to interrogate the legitimacy and the boundaries of gender scripts through parodies of masculine excess, homophobia, homosociality, and sexual bravado, to name only a few negative aspects. Indeed, whereas U.S. sitcoms such as Full House, Roseanne, and Friends have at times typecast their male characters through a narrow prism of acceptable masculinity, Sunny reverses this expectation by positing its principal male characters as invariably incompetent, effete, laughably downtrodden, and downright pathetic. While each episode of Sunny features a similar status quo in accordance with formulaic situational comedies, there is no ritual error, and the characters, both female and male, learn no ritual lesson. How then does the dearth of any redemptive male qualities intersect with Sunny's representations of male scripts? Moreover, how does the show use the tensions arising from characters' performances of masculinity to expose and deconstruct their toxic qualities as part of a broader cultural commentary, all through the microcosm of Patty's Pub, the bar where the show takes place? In this presentation, we analyzed two case studies in the figures of Dennis Reynolds, portrayed by Glenn Howerton, and Mac McDonald, played by Rob McElhenney, both of whom work to emulate a white urban hegemonic masculinity that's rooted in exaggerated behaviors and heteropatriarchal expectations that find validity only within their shared homosocial milieu. Nevertheless, each character experiences failures and inadequacies that reflect the innate frailty of their respective masculinities and the unattainability of this idealized brand of white masculinity. This study argues that each character represents a parodic embodiment of homohysteria and heterosexual instability on the one hand, as we see with Mac, and on the other, the assumed necessity of hypersexuality and an imagined social superiority against women and non-white individuals to achieve desired masculine capital. And we see that in Dennis. As such, Sunny posits this endeavor toward this idealized masculinity as a self-defeating process, one that is given to perpetual crises and failures that demonstrate the contemptibility of this shared masculine standard. Ultimately, both Mac and Dennis strive to achieve ideals rooted in hypermasculine bravado, but they confront situations that comically locate them in subordinate positions of power. Thus, by parodying both characters' masculinity performances, as a fragile and foundering enterprise, the show elevates failure and incompetence as foundational hallmarks of its character's white urban masculinity, contrasting long-standing expectations that fetter power and dominance to masculinity proper and deconstructing what Judith Gardner would call the masquerade of naturalness that has endowed masculinities with such power and longevity in the first place.
So we'll be setting the stage of masculine fragility, Philadelphia and Patty's Pub. In order to resist irrelevance and maintain their presence among profitable retail establishments, the owners of Patty's Pub find that they have to adjust their business model, at least superficially, to remain competitive with non-heteronormative immigrant restaurateurs offering upscale atmospheres and superior products, as we see in The Gang Solves the North Korea situation. Additionally, they work to expand their marketing in order to appeal to Philadelphia's LGBTQ+ and multicultural communities. We see the gang gets racist and Mac finds his pride. Throughout Sonny's 15 seasons, Dennis embodies a spectrum of grievances and entitlements that reflect the privileges of his racial identity and reinforce the perniciousness of his male identity. He generally gravitates toward anything that supports his insular worldview, thereby stunting his social consciousness and cementing a cycle of noxious actions that he undertakes to acquire or demonstrate masculine capital. Time and again, he negates opportunities to integrate minority voices into his own worldview and leisure activities. When characters of color pass through, Dennis ostracizes them and reasserts his status as the linchpin of the gang, despite the fact that his presence results in his and his friends' perpetual stagnation. In season 13's opener, the gang makes Patty's great again. The gang recruits Cindy, Mindy Kaling, an intelligent and ambitious woman of color who not only renders the cohort more diverse, but is also able to successfully execute scams, thereby increasing Patty's profit margin.
So Cindy also establishes a sentiment of solidarity with Dee, thereby empowering the only other woman in the male-dominated friend group. In a turn of events, Dennis, who had departed during season 12's finale, makes his return, sneaking into the bar off-camera and surprising both viewers and his friends. Mac, Charlie, Dee, and Frank fail to notice Dennis's arrival since they are engaged in a conversation with the business-minded and sharply dressed Cindy, who justifies herself as a productive addition to the group by extolling their potential. Quote, "You are better than this. I know you can be better than this, and I can help you," says Cindy. "But you've got to make a choice. You can either leave Dennis behind or you can stay the same, keep doing what you're doing." Dennis's actions are self-referential. They feed into a white masculine aura that self-immunizes against any critique and that lacks any self-awareness or impetus toward consciousness raising. And yet this is the point. With such narrow worldviews informing the Patty's Pub microcosm, both Dennis and Mac encapsulate the privilege of not being in tune with their own privilege. Of course, both characters acknowledge that racism is wrong, but they do so only to tout a social truism, an action that has more to do with their own virtue signaling than it does with their pursuit of moral integrity. The co-opting of mainstream cultural tropes about race in order to mask their own shortcomings further spotlights racial ignorance as constitutive of their male identities. Dennis and Mac lean into amenable cultural tropes about race insofar as it garnishes a white male script hostile to the advances of women and minorities. The disconnect between the audience's tacit knowledge and the character's lack of self-awareness creates a humor that crosscuts the rest of the episode. Dennis and Mac fail, yet again, to achieve any substantive gains other than the perpetuation of a male script that is incongruent with the city culture at large. Of the 5 leads, Dennis embodies a depravity and thirst for dominance unmatched by his peers and reflects the most noxious elements of masculine bravado, specifically in regard to his use of sex to secure power. Sonny, however, recasts this strategy as a self-destructive cultural pattern that fails to secure its objectives, one that perpetuates a frailty that paradoxically imperils and sustains Dennis's male identity. The allure of any hegemonic masculinity, and this is based off of principally Raywin Connell's research, finds footing in a cultural ideal. This in turn creates a metric for legitimizing the performances of those who seek to emulate that ideal. For its male characters, Sonny posits self-defeating practices as masculine hallmarks that only hold appeal within the Paddy's Pub microcosm, a space that, minus Dennis's twin sister Dee, is owned, operated, and overseen by white men. Consider Dennis, the most manipulative and best educated member of the gang. He is co-owner of Paddy's Pub and holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Pennsylvania. He is comically oversexed, aggressive, cruel, selfish, narcissistic, and he exhibits notable signs of psychopathy. He often uses his superior cunning and near total lack of empathy to manipulate Dee, Mac, and Charlie into giving him whatever he pleases, with little to no regard for the damage that his schemes will inflict upon their physical and emotional health. Dennis is especially callous to his twin sister Dee, to whom he refers as gawky and bird-like throughout the show's 14 seasons, a derisive and sexist maneuver that he and his male peers use to bolster their camaraderie.
Dennis consistently objectifies women as either trophies or instruments of revenge, ultimately configuring them as ancillary devices in his quest for power, sexual dominance, and prestige. In all instances, the relationships are short-lived and serve only to satisfy, however superficially, his depravity and egoism. On par with Philadelphia's evolving social landscape, Dennis's emotional and mental instability contribute to his inability to reap the rewards of this masculine ideal. Whereas Mac seeks to emulate his father, Dennis strives toward a more generalized masculine aura based in long-standing, however culturally outdated, forms of excess and hyperbole. That is, he represents an amalgam of qualities that safeguard his own power and privilege through exclusionary needs: casual racism, unabashed sexism, and a voracious sexual appetite raveled only by his matchless narcissism. Through Dennis, Sonny perverts the classic image of the white masculine Casanova in situational comedies. Dennis is a manipulative sex addict whose myriad encounters do little to mask his deep-seated emotional disorders and insecurities. Howerton himself notes, and I quote, "a certain degree of toxic masculinity," end quote, alongside unabashed egocentrism as Dennis's greatest liabilities. At best, Dennis is pathetic in his unrelenting attempts to remedy personal traumas and feelings of alienation and irrelevance with meaningless one-night stands. At worst, he uses sex as a cathartic outlet for his overtly sociopathic tendencies. Either way, viewers locate his exaggerated performances of masculinity as anachronisms, laughable leftovers from a bygone era where the hegemony of white heterosexual men seemingly remained undaunted. Despite his countless hookups with women, as well as his self-appraisal as the all-powerful golden god, if you see season 7's High School Reunion Part 2, The Gang's Revenge, Dennis fails to achieve the benefits of this hegemonic masculine ideal. His self-proclaimed divinity likely takes its origins from a quote by Led Zeppelin frontman Robert Plant, who referred to himself as the Golden God during a friendly food fight and scuffle with George Harrison, former lead guitarist of the Beatles, if anyone isn't familiar with George Harrison, at the birthday party of John Bonham, former drummer of Led Zeppelin. And in a 2020 interview for Rolling Stone, Plant recalls that his iconic decree was ironic, nonsensical, and said in jest. It is fitting, then, that Dennis interprets the rocker's memorable declaration at face value. Dennis idealizes and identifies with Plant's retrograded and hypersexualized stage persona, which is similar to that of David Bowie, Mick Jagger, and other white rockers of the era. Dennis believes himself to be the godlike embodiment of this gaunt, seemingly irresistible masculinity, mythical, unrealistic, and laughable to everyone but himself. Grounded in his admiration for white men, whose penchant for excess elevates them as legendary male icons, Dennis espouses delusions of grandeur that take root in the search for privilege and power that is coded white, and that, as the show's irony brings to the fore, is quickly losing its broader cultural appeal. Furthermore, rather than bolster his masculine credentials, Dennis's narcissism, penchant for promiscuity, and complete lack of a moral compass often leave him susceptible to manipulation by other members of the gang, notably Frank. In season 3's The Gang Gets Whacked, part 1, Frank, needing to pay off a debt to some mobsters, preys upon Dennis's vulnerability and faith in his own sexual prowess by tricking him to working as a male escort and a prostitute for rich women at a local country club. Initially, Dennis finds no enjoyment in those roles as he is unwilling to place himself in a passive position whereby he would be objectified and made submissive to those who he deems inferior. Nevertheless, Frank convinces Dennis by promising him employment as a handsome male companion to classy older ladies in exchange for money and elaborate gifts. Frank's ruse becomes apparent in the following conversation with Dee, in which he feigns that Dennis is the head of their business arrangement. I am not a prostitute. I am providing. Let me handle this. Dennis is providing a very important service to lonely people in need. Really? So he speaks for you now? No, he doesn't have to speak if he doesn't want to. I don't? Really? No, you just leave everything to me. All you have to do is sit there, relax, have yourself a drink, and just keep looking handsome, Dennis. By assuring Dennis a power dynamic in which he is still able to maintain control, Frank succeeds in maintaining him into prostitution by appealing to his desire to subordinate others for his personal gain. Frank only achieves his goal by falsely promising that Dennis will remain in a position of power. Blinded by his narcissism and compelled to live up to his sexualized bravado, Dennis fails to foresee the pitfalls in Frank's scheme. Rather than afford him power, his exploits create successive failures and disappointments that underscore both the fragility of his male identity and the unattainability of the hegemonic ideal against a diverse urban backdrop no longer hospitable to such qualities.
We'll finish quickly with our other case study. If Dennis embodies the laughably oversexed heterosexual male incapable of reaping any meaningful benefits from his promiscuity and thirst for power, Mac personifies both the fragility of compulsory heterosexuality as an institution, as well as the homohysteria that informs heterosexual male camaraderie. Mac McDonald is a case in point. An insecure, irascible, and for most of the show's duration, closeted gay man, Mac navigates Philadelphia's social scene in ways that highlight both his internalized inferiority and his dependence on other men for a sense of male identity. Mac's father, Luther, is a convicted felon who spent all of Mac's formative years and early adulthood in jail for dealing methamphetamines. Luther's lengthy incarceration and paternal neglect result in Mac imbuing his father with an almost mythical status as a role model. With his masculine standard in mind, Mac envisions himself as the brawn of the gang, dressing in sleeveless t-shirts in order to call attention to his biceps and triceps, which Dennis refers to as, quote, his glam muscles. Despite his volatile temper, overdeveloped sense of competitiveness, and claim of expertise in hand-to-hand combat, Mac's cowardice manifests itself wherever he encounters a dangerous situation. The stoicism characteristic of male exemplars, however, eludes Mac, as do his attempts at disguising his homosexuality with strict adherence to Christianity and one-night stands with women. Throughout 12 seasons, Mac strives to gain validation from characters who embody the masculine aura that he fails to achieve. His delusions about his male identity, alongside his feeble emulations of tough white urban men, constitute a notable aspect of McIlhenny's character, whose anxieties and compensatory actions contribute to the show's comedic appeal. Indeed, Mac's hypermasculine behaviors alienate him from the gang, who disdain and revile their companion for performances that ultimately fail to mask his sensitivity and sexuality, both of which remain obvious to Sonny's other leads. In season 4's previously referenced episode, Dennis and Mac accurately conclude that Mac employs oddly excessive masculine behaviors to distract him from his homoerotic fantasies and sexual orientation. Despite Mac's physical attraction to his friends, he maintains his status as one of the gang and continues to reside with Dennis as his roommate. In fact, the only person who appears troubled by Mac's homosexuality is Mac himself, who throughout most of the show understands his same-sex attraction as a quality that depreciates his masculine capital. As a result of his homosexual desires, Mac attempts to compensate for not being a hardened man's man like his father, Luther, which ends up creating frustration among other members of the gang. Indeed, Mac's bossiness, unfettered aggression, and incessant proselytizing are a facade. They serve no other purpose other than to antagonize his friends, who eventually find Mac more amiable once he has ceased deluding himself and officially comes out of the closet to his friends in season 12. Mac's struggles largely consist of his inability to reconcile his sexual orientation with his desire to be perceived as manly. This incongruity in turn yields what Eric Anderson would identify as homohysteria. His sudden weight gain notwithstanding, Mac's perennial turmoil results in inertia and minimal character development over 12 seasons. However, Mac's prolonged internal tug-of-war culminates in a breathtaking moment of catharsis in the episode Mac Finds His Pride, season 13's emotional finality in which Mac comes out to his father through an ornately choreographed and emotionally charged piece of modern dance performed in the jail in which Luther is incarcerated. And Joe will go to the conclusion.
Sonny's initial popularity was largely thanks to college-age men, as Joe Watterson notes, but since its debut, the show has garnered a loyal following across several demographics, especially among millennials. The program's unrelenting cynicism has not alienated audiences who have lived through the tumultuous George W. Bush administration, global economic crisis of 2008, ensuing and at times shaky economic rebound that marked the Obama era, and controversial election and tenure of Donald Trump, all of which have significantly impacted generational outlooks. At the time of our writing, millennials are now expected to earn less than preceding generations, pay significantly more for housing, and accrue astronomical student loan debt, to name only a few of the most daunting obstacles.
While the gender dimensions of these phenomena lie beyond the scope of this essay, we are particularly mindful of the, quote, aggrieved entitlement that has informed white U.S. masculinities following neoliberal economic reforms of the 1980s and advances made by both women and the LGBTQ plus communities. Approaching these characters' representations of white urban masculinity as reactionary and defensive, then, we understand their failed masculinities as timely cultural commentaries that satirize the fragility of their shared masculine code. In turn, Sonny's viewers understand the actions of both Dennis and Mac as anachronistic pollutants to a more equitable and meaningful gender order. Through the prism of dark comedy and against the backdrop of its urban setting, It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia strips the perceived naturalness from this male script, and it compels audiences to consider such behaviors exactly for what they are: feeble and failing attempts to achieve a masculine ideal that was never worth emulating in the first place.
Okay, fantastic. Our next panelist, Kasturi Ghosh is a PhD candidate at the University of Waterloo, Ontario, in Canada, focusing on the portrayal of vampires and other monstrous entities created by Anne Rice, Poppy Z. Brite, and Charlaine Harris. Her research studies contemporary Gothic fiction of the American South as the outcome of homogeneous identities and boundaries forced upon the region and the uncanny reemergence of its inherent plural characteristics. Kasturi has served as an assistant professor of English for 8 years in her home country, India, and has published papers in peer-reviewed journals. Her interests: Gothic studies, gender studies, popular literature and culture, and adaptation studies.
Thank you, Susan. Hello, everyone. I'm very grateful to the organizing committee of the Louisville Conference on Literature and Culture for giving me this opportunity. I would also like to thank everyone for attending our panel. I'm super excited to present before you and receive your valuable feedback. My paper is titled Imperiled Bodies, Monstrous Women in the Southern Gothic Works of Rice, Brite, and Harris. Gothic narratives have long been considered products of repression or the return of the repressed past. My broader research examines contemporary Gothic fiction of the American South in terms of what scholars such as Edward Sugden have called spatial compression, a spatialized version of the repressed, where what is effaced is the diverse global and cultural entanglements that made the South what it is. Louisiana, which features prominently in the tradition I examine, offers a paradigmatic example of spatial compression. Southern Gothic texts characterize New Orleans and the fictional bon toms in Louisiana in terms of its diverse global, racial, and linguistic histories, but at the same time, they reimagine this diversity as a fundamentally stable and homogeneous type of local color, effacing the diversity that continues to define places in the present. I argue that contemporary white authors of the Southern Gothic use spatial compression in ways that perpetuate this repression and compression, tacitly promoting white supremacist heteropatriarchal narratives, even as their texts also offer opportunities to destabilize these narratives and to allow for both the return of the repressed identities and compressed social spaces, geographies, and intercultural dimensions of the South. By analyzing the Southern Gothic works of Rice, Brite, and Harris, I delved into the region's past and present in ways that critique its repression of subordinated racial and gender identities, those earlier global entanglements, and the South's current and actual heterogeneity re-emerge into focus when texts disrupt the myth of homogeneity, often by using the supernatural as a metaphor for race and gender identities. While contemporary Gothic writing has moved in the direction of embracing heterogeneity, for example, in the writings of Stephen Graham Jones, Toni Morrison, Jasmine Ward, and in the cinematic Gothic of the Blade trilogy, the Underworld series, the Gothic can still invite authors to treat diversity in the language of psychological repression and spatial compression. That means that some of the most popular and influential examples of the Southern Gothic can aim to be subversive, but wind up making an argument that, in my analysis, is more conservative. Anne Rice, Poppy Z. Brite, and Charlene Harris have been celebrated as using Gothic conventions for socially progressive purposes, yet even as they seem to challenge monolithic notions of Southern identity, I contend that their work still cling to forced homogeneity. They tend to ruthlessly crush the monstrous characters they frame as deviants with religious extremism, exclusion, and violent expressions of racism, misogyny, and homophobia. I argue that not only are these texts haunted by the past, but they are anxious about the very prospect of facing the heterogeneity of the present, even if that means accepting the presence and agency of the subordinate gender. While white male characters are the norm in these works, women are the aberrations. To illustrate their fear and anxiety around the feminine, I will use examples from Rice's Vampire Chronicles, Brite's standalone novels, and Harris's Southern Vampire Mysteries. The quest for his vampire lineage not only leads Lestat, the protagonist of Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles, to travel east and discover the Afro-Asian origin of the vampires, but also to discover the matriarchs, the first vampire Akasha, an Egyptian queen of Mesopotamian origin, and the Middle Eastern Maharet, one of the early vampires created by Akasha. Maharet also had a human child, Miriam, before turning into a vampire, and traces her line of succession through all of humanity after 6 millennia of her existence. This is made possible by Maharet's great family tree that she actively maintains over the ages, uniting all human races and communities all over the world with her bloodline. In the third book of the Chronicles, The Queen of the Damned, the matrilineal kinship between all human beings, as well as between vampires and humans, re-emerge with the matriarchs Akasha and Maharet. As the first vampire, Akasha created more vampires by passing her blood to humans after draining them to the point of death, which they passed down to other vampires, making Akasha's blood present in all of them. But Akasha and Maharet differ in their outlooks. Upon waking from millennia of sleep, Akasha wants to rid the world of majority of men and create a safe haven for women, as she believes men are the cause of all forms of violence. She seduces Lestat with her vision and embarks on a mission to wipe out all men from the face of earth. On the other hand, Maharet plays the role of the silent observer and a nurturer of humanity. Though she traces her bloodline through women alone, she is not hostile towards men. By the end of the book, Akasha's scheme of social engineering is rejected as too radical and exclusionary, and she is killed by Maharet and her sister Makare to protect the human world as we know it. Though Makare devours Akasha's brain, absorbing her vampire core, making Makare the new queen of the damned, it is Lestat who replaces Akasha as the prince and monarch of all vampires. The twins recede into the background to continue to quietly observe and preserve their human kin, or the Great Family. The Great Family does not come up in the Chronicles until later in Prince Lestat, 26 years after the publication of The Queen of the Damned, where Maharet is murdered, leaving it to corporate lawyers to distribute her wealth among all the members of her great family. Akasha, the mother of all vampires, was killed earlier. But in this volume, she is dethroned as the origin point of all vampires, and the more ancient white male spirit, Amel, is credited for the existence and immortality of vampiric beings. Amel also telepathically compels lesser vampires like Rosamandis to release him from Makare's body, where he resides as the sacred vampire core, as it is unsuitable for him because Makare is a Middle Eastern disabled woman whose tongue was ripped out by Akasha when she was alive. Seduced by Amel, Rosamundis kills Maharet to reach Mekare and claim Amel for himself. With Maharet's death, the matrilineal line dies as well. Both Akasha and Maharet and their matrilineal lines are discovered in the novels to put an end to them and re-establish Amel and Lestat as the originator and monarch of the vampires. The compressed spaces envisioned for women, like the radical feminist safe haven imagined by Akasha, and the great family tree that traces only the women of Maharet's line, open up only for a final collapse and a restoration of the patrilineal and patriarchal order. Maharet gets to live a little longer, as she is the nurturing mother that Akasha is not. Back in New Orleans, Merrick, the only female vampire with the Chronicle, is also presented stereotypically. Born in the Mayfair family of witches and of African American heritage, Merrick is fair-skinned and can pass for white. She is also a powerful witch and a seductress. She takes advantage of Vampire Louis' guilt over losing his immortal daughter Claudia and manipulates the emotional Louis into turning her into a vampire. Her manipulation infuriates other vampires like the British vampire and patriarch David Talbot, who was Merrick's friend when they were both humans. Merrick is shunned by all vampires and later redeems herself by helping Lestat to vanquish the spirit goblin. Goblin siphons blood off his twin brother and vampire Quinn. Fearing the increased power of the spirit goblin and its implications, Lestat helps Quinn destroy Goblin. Merrick makes it happen by immolating herself along with Goblin's mortal remains in Blackwood Farm. She sacrifices herself for the cause supported by Lestat to prove her goodness. Another African-American woman, Jasmine, the servant of the Blackwoods, is shown to enjoy the advances of Tarquin Blackwood, someone half her age and like a brother to her. While his mother Patsy is emotionally absent, Tarquin is brought up by his nanny and Jasmine's mother, Little Ida, and her mother, Big Ramona. His emotional dependence is so great on these women that he sleeps chastely with them in his bed, even as a teenager. Still, he harbors an incestuous desire for Jasmine, and Jasmine is shown to welcome it. She secretly bears Tarquin's child without bothering to inform Tarquin about her pregnancy. She's not a victim like many slave women who are under their white masters, but is written as someone who enjoys sex with her master. Tarquin is free from the guilt of exploiting his Black employee or impregnating her with his illegitimate child. Jasmine is the seductress and not the victim, unlike many slave women of the past. Though the vampire women in Rice's series like Akasha, Maharet, Mekare, and Merrick seem equally empowered as the vampire men, most of them still play second fiddle to the men and are time and again forced to play the role of the nurturer and called upon to sacrifice themselves. When they do not conform, they are infantilized and murdered, like the child vampire Claudia and Queen Akasha. There are very few women of significance in Poppy Z. Brite's Southern Gothic works, which mostly focus on trans and gay male characters and relationships. The few women that are there, irrespective of their sexual orientations, are victims of patriarchal violence. Vampires are a superior species in the lost souls who procreate hybrids with human females, who are seduced and raped by the vampire Zilla, and then murdered by their vampire progeny as the fledglings eat their way out of their human mothers' bodies like that of Jesse's and Anne's. Not only does the mother die with the birth of the vampiric child, but there are also no memories of the mother for the child, who, like Jesse's son, the hybrid called Nothing, looks only for his father. Anne, on the other hand, deserves to be raped and impregnated with the monstrous vampiric child, as she, in her vanity, seduces and sleeps with her own father and is not good enough for her boyfriend Steve, who, despite her devotion and her ability to take on his abuse repeatedly, prefers his homosocial bond with his friend Ghosh over his girlfriend. In Brite's The Crow, the body of trans woman Lucrece becomes the site of pseudoscientific experiments by a serial killer named Jordan, who finds Lucrece's body curious as the site of plural identities. Yet, if this horror does destabilizing work regarding gender, as Jack Halberstam has argued in reference to Silence of the Lambs in his book Skin Shows, the tendency of Brite's fiction is to reduce both cis and trans feminine bodies to spectacular sites of violence. Just like Halberstam points out in his book, skin represents the monstrosity of the surfaces for Lucrece. Though assigned male at birth, after gender reassignment surgery, she gets the body or skin she identified with and wanted. But to the serial killer, it is still a man's body disguised as a woman's, which the serial killer wants to unmask through mutilation. While Buffalo Bill, as analyzed by Halberstam, becomes a more layered body of many surfaces when he wears his woman suit made from the skins of the women he killed, Jordan is looking to take off the many layers that hide Lucrece's identity. He is also looking for a switch in Lucrece's body, which, if he locates, will allow him to turn off and escape his own repressed homosexual desires. Therefore, he strips down Lucrece, like his other trans women victims, to uncover what he believes to be her true identity. If gender is a construct and identities can be fluid, then bodies are the locus of plurality, in a way to liberate the individuals of the constructs. Instead, that plurality located in her body becomes Lucrece's bane. Jordan puts Lucrece on an operating table under bright lights, and like the cinematic gaze explained by Laura Mulvey, Jordan's pseudo-medical gaze has two ways of looking at women, both organized around defending against her castration, and both of which therefore presuppose a male or masculine gazer, a sadistic voyeuristic look, whereby the gazer solves his unpleasure at female lack by seeing the woman punished, and a fetishistic scopophilic look whereby the gazer solves his unpleasure by fetishizing the body in whole or part. As a post-op trans woman, Lucrece embodies that lack by choice and hence is of interest to Jordan. She is brought back by the supernatural crow from the title of the book, but dies after exacting her revenge on Jordan. Women's bodies are violently misused as gendered and reproductive bodies, beyond which they do not have individual identities in these works. Brite suffered from gender dysphoria before undergoing gender reassignment surgeries of his own. Perhaps through his personal experiences, he learned firsthand how queer identities and bodies are often compressed and repressed within normative gender identities. Even when they come out, they are often treated with suspicion, and their non-normativity is interpreted as monstrous. Consequently, another closeted homosexual character in the novel, Detective Gray, is terrified of coming out after he helplessly watches his partner, the African-American lesbian detective Linda Getty, bleed to death because no one would come to her aid owing to her sexuality. The ruthlessness of New Orleans Police Department makes an example of Linda, forcing Gray to overcompensate by acting hypermasculine and by publicly ridiculing queer individuals. By doing so, Gray hides his own sexuality, escapes social ostracism, and its violent repercussions. On the other hand, Charlene Harris's series has a female protagonist in Suki Stackhouse. To remain economically and socially independent, Suki endures emotional and psychological trauma and tremendous physical violence. The human-fae hybrid, Suki is a telepath who labels her telepathy as a disability because it makes her a misfit in her small-town bonds. To accommodate the simple and crazy Suki, Harris creates a parallel dimension of the fae compressed within bondoms. In the novel From Dead to Worse, the 8th book in the Southern Vampire Mysteries, Suki traces her fae lineage back to her grandmother Adel's affair with the fairy Fenton. But this dimension, with all her fae kin in it, is closed off from the human world when a rogue fairy Brandon vows to kill all fae-human hybrids, causing another collapse of the space within space. Also, because of her telepathy, Suki often gets embroiled in supernatural conflicts, and her fairy blood attracts all kinds of supernatural creatures and communities compressed within the mainstream human society. To maintain her independence as a working-class woman and her individuality as a hybrid telepath, Suki often endures torture and is beaten to pulp by warring factions of different species. Suki negotiates her identity with violence, but unlike the woman in Rice and Brite's novels, Suki comes out alive at the end of the series. The victim hero woman who survives in low-budget horror films and brings the killer down at the end is termed as the final girl by Carol J. Clover. Clover points out in the preface to the 2015 edition of her book, Men, Women, and Chainsaws, that contrary to popular interpretation, the final girl is not a female avenger, nor is she a triumphant feminist hero, but a tortured or accidental survivor and a victim hero, with the emphasis on victim. Clover further explains that the final girl is the one who we follow in the story, and her fear and pain by proxy becomes us. The final girl gives us fuller, more intense, and unambiguous access to the victim's point of view, in effect putting us in the mind and body of the prey rather than the predator. She acts as a female surrogate through whom the male spectator is more willingly than we might expect to feel himself on the receiving end of the brutal, humiliating acts, one after another, including sexual penetration. According to Clover, the final girl is simply an agreed upon fiction, and the male viewer's use of her as a vehicle for his own sadomasochistic fantasies is an act of perhaps timeless dishonesty. Clover uses Stephen King's Carrie as an example, where adolescent boys may identify with Carrie, and that identification, the official denial of that identification, and the larger implications of both these things are what her book is about. Clover calls the final girls boyish. While Suki is not boyish, she is feminine enough to act out in gratifying ways, a way unapproved for adult males, the terrors and masochistic pleasures of the underlying fantasy, but not so feminine as to disturb the structures of male competence and sexuality. Suki is a waitress at a bar. She is blonde and curvy, but she also has the ability to penetrate minds and hear the thoughts of the people around her without their knowledge, and in the process violate their privacy. Her ability, or disability as she terms it, makes her undesirable to most human men in the novel series, who view her as a freak. On the other hand, supernatural communities weaponize her ability again and again. Her involuntary ability makes her paranoid around others, and paranoia is a final girl's trait. Like final girls on screen, we hear Suki shriek, we see her run, flinch, jump, or fall, sustain injury and mutilation. Her will to survive is astonishing. In the end, bloody and staggering, she finds her way. Just as they bear down on her, she turns the tables on them and escapes. She does not die because she is the surrogate for the male spectator, a man compressed within a woman. Unlike Rice and Brite, Harris presents us with a female protagonist, but because she stands for the male spectator, there is no reason to consider her a feminist triumph or a female avenger. On the other hand, there are very few women of significance in Brite's novels. Those that are there, cis or transgender, end up as spectacular sites of male violence. Though there are a few women characters of significance in Rice's novels, they are stereotyped as seductresses or nurturing mothers, and eventually set aside and even eliminated to re-establish the patriarchal order and lineage. The South, as represented in the works of these authors, compresses spaces that belong to women and repress their identities, which re-emerge in the narratives only to receive a more final burial at the end. These are some of the works that I've cited. Thank you so much for your patience.
Okay, wow, thank you. Okay, I'm Susan Vanderborg from USC in Columbia. My research field is contemporary experimental book art, poetry, and science fiction. I have articles on speculative artist books and science fiction studies, the Journal of Artist Books and Textual Practice, as well as some articles on biopoetry, robot love poetry, poetic installations, conceptual poems, and graphic documents. Okay, let me go to screen share here. All right, can people see this? Awesome. Okay, fantastic. Mine is a bit different. The Pedagogy of Unreadable Books is the title. I've always been really interested in invented alien languages and speculative fiction, and that's already a pretty niche subgenre. So what is the value of teaching alien speculative fiction that is actually unreadable? Luigi Serafini's Codex Seraphinianus, 1981, is an encyclopedia of a fantasized planet written in an undecodable language. It's not just we haven't decoded it yet, it's not meant to be decoded, it's meant to be nonsense. And illustrated with dreamlike figures, but it also demonstrates Craig Dworkin's argument in Reading the Illegible that even the most seemingly unreadable texts still signify. So what does it signify here? Scholarship on the Codex acknowledges how its how its visual conventions, lines arranged like indices or tables of contents, structure those unreadable words, a mix that enables, in Carla Bacelli's reading, universal reading, as she says, based on, quote, accepting otherness. I would argue, however, that such unreadable texts, far from being universal, actually offer unique pedagogical opportunities for talking about colonial knowledge structures. Teaching the Codex uncovers and challenges a particular type of rebooted stories, persistent Western cultural biases about knowledge reporting and presentation, constructing cultural outsiders and perceived constructing cultural insiders and perceived outsiders via the book form. Students, for example, can explore how the Codex, and you can kind of see it on that first page, represents supposedly alien epistemology with all the recognizable dividers and marks in Western page layout. As Bacelli and Malagard et al. Note, the model for the Codex is the Western medieval manuscript, and a little later, the 15th century coded Voynich manuscript, which may be another Italian artifact. It's often cited as an antecedent of Seraphini's Codex. And then the Enlightenment Encyclopedia, and it's an encyclopedia morphed through Borges's Tlan story of a secret society crafting over centuries the history first of an invented country inserted into a volume of a respected encyclopedia, then one volume of an encyclopedia on an imaginary planet with plans to reproduce the full encyclopedia in one of the planet's languages. The Borges connection is especially significant, I would add, because Tlan, Borges' story, is less a playful gesture showing the careful creation of a speculative world than really a horror story. As the alien planets invented history and literature, even when recognized as inventions, slowly take over the real world, like proto-viral memes. In Borges' contemporary context, Tlan was published in 1940. The story warns readers not to succumb to others' plausible, seductive, totalizing systems. He compares Tlan's allure to Nazism, among other movements. And it's no coincidence that the American promoter of the secret project made his money from slave labor and brothels in Borges' story. I don't know how much Serafini intended his own Codex as a conscious critique of Western book-bounded epistemology. And I don't want to downplay its genuine playfulness and humor, but the text is in fact brilliant at showing us skeletal epistemological structures on the page spaces. We have, in place of content, signifiers of information ordering, what Joanna Drucker in The Visible Word would describe as a marked text full of devices designed, quote, to hierarchize information, a tactic she notes being common in advertising that forces the language into a public domain, aggressively situating the reader with this manipulative utilization of the strategies of graphic design. In Serafini's Codex, we can distinguish title head and subhead style lines in larger font, bolded words and letters for significance, the information trees that we see on this first page, the indented bullet points, the branching, indexical bracketed subdivisions and associated numbers, or the neatly captioned illustrations in varying sizes on different pages. They're kind of routine, they're kind of uniform here, but they differ on varying pages. The measured specimens with labeled parts, all mapping discrete categories and subcategories in a hierarchy of importance, distinctions that controlled, settled, and mentally shaping their readers, just to use a few of the definitional words associated with colonizing in the Oxford English Dictionary. What are they categorizing here? Well, the planets, this invented planets, plants, insects, and animals, like some European Renaissance Wunderkammer, all the way up to humanoids and their food, language, games, and architecture. The humanoid bodies are represented as clearly racialized and gendered, often with strong colonial overtones. Unsurprisingly, since as Walter Mignolo notes, modern racial constructions were originally designed, quote, to manufacture colonial differences. The Codex's pages of profiled heads might be historical figures in some chapter on the planet's events, but they also have very unsettling similarities to eugenic pseudoscience textbooks on supposed racial traits, such as Charles Benedict Davenport's 1913 Heredity in relation to eugenics. Each entry with its description neatly divided by a dark vertical line includes an identifying type, presumably name, followed by a parenthetical number range. This could be birth and death dates, or phrenology measurements, some other ranking range of their humanity, intelligence, or habitat, and descriptions below. The privileged racial construct, however, is clear. In surrounding pages, the models portraying generalized humanoid anatomy default to white, and each of the profiled heads of whatever phenotype sits symbolically atop a white shirt. A later map section has country divisions that look vaguely like Europe's, including a suggestion of Italy's own distinctive boot outline, and one country keeps expanding via war or conquest. The comparative heads are actually preceded by full pages of natural history style, natural museums style exhibits of indigenous figures in their local habitats, also with starkly racialized and binary gender differences. These pages of exotic eroticized others open with a dark-skinned man wearing only bundles of straw, next to straw huts and a volcanic environment. His only equipment, a lit torch and pipe that seem primed to set all the other constructs ablaze. On another page, a dark-skinned woman has elaborate metal jewelry that suggests ankle chains. She not only gathers fruit, but wears it, unsubtly suggesting her as another commodity to be consumed, just as a different woman on another page is clothed in a woven fish exoskeleton. If this all is intended as parodic of the colonial gaze, as you could argue the absurdist, surrealist visual details might suggest, I don't know, it's uncomfortably pushing the line of reinforcing the stereotypes. The deeper subversion here is less in the artwork than in the information structures themselves. Again, perhaps with a tip of the hat to Borges's own love of elaborate systems interrupted by telltale gaps and contradictions. It's not simply that captions and measurements are, of course, literally nonsense, but the representations and comparison structures themselves are inconsistent, suggesting lapses in the encyclopedic process. Here's an encyclopedia that leaves some things blank or permanently skeletal. We saw just a skeletal head on that previous profile page. One profile face is entirely missing above its white shirt. Another is a deracialized skeleton. One is skinless and half bandaged. A few break profile, and some stare directly back at us, returning the objectifying gaze, and two have no illustrations whatsoever, not even that white shirt. We will argue that race and gender classifications are ultimately designed to hide the classifiers, but Seraphini's book does emphasize whiteness itself as a constructed category. There are white figures, like on this page, in the Natural Museum History diorama style section, which, as McNullo notes, rarely happens, i.e. showing whites as indigenous. There's also an absolutely amazing Adam and Eve style Genesis page, this, about the construction of whiteness, where hallucinogenically mushroom-headed Western-style workers, here seemingly picked up from some twisted Western film and frontier-style spurred boots and cowboy dusters, dyed an odd red, so white pink tinted skins lifted down from meat hooks like another commodity. Around a skeleton as two others wait for their turn, one standing fascinated by the process, the other skeleton's gaze coyly averted. The finished bodies then examined with curiosity, puzzlement, or narcissism, their new identities in mirrors, so focused that they miss their fellow transformee, and the whole process throughout is compared to and informed by books and their knowledge structures. The operator's red clothing double is as a pun on the red RAD lines of books. The white bodies are stitched up, the stitches resembling Coptic stitches in early Codex bookbinding, on a white operating or work table supported only by stacks of books. Thick, deluxe, canonical-looking editions that convey wealth and privilege, and that seem grouped together primarily by the color and shape of their outer covers, as if asking readers what books in our world, what Bibles, references, histories underlie or reflect back racialized constructions of identity. Other pages visualize white classifiers' attempts at invisibility. The head profile section has a faint-lined, literally sketchy gentleman whose wig is vaguely 18th century founding father style, or the white person in a concealing white hood. It's the wrong shape, but perhaps with inevitable Klan echoes. It's even more pronounced in the earlier portrait of a military officer. We start, I'm just going to scroll down here. We start, interestingly, on this page. Okay, we start, this is the left-hand page, with a white arm hollowed out, proto-cyborg-like, to contain around faintly bleeding edges a gun into which bullets drop divinely from an upended box above. If the firing mechanism has to be implanted, the pointing finger, a finger that's quick to reference or categorize others, is seamless. No bleeding implant lines here, seamlessly transformed into the gun's barrel. And the picture below, the official draws on a long symbolic white glove to conceal the weapon, even as it accentuates the pointing finger. Below this arm is a range of human and animal skulls, a context that dehumanizes the people who were killed, each skull displaying the bullet hole that killed them. This page segues into the literally hollow, this is the facing page, the literally hollow full-length dress uniform of the officer, as we see whom the arm is attached to, or rather don't see, because it's an invisible man whose colonial imperial references are temporarily very ambiguous. The torso may be a fusion of imperial British and French uniforms with epaulets and medals pinned to a chest that's both portly and empty, an authoritative and absent center. Another 18th century style wig hovers over a monocle, suggesting a one-sided or maybe class-inflected reading. One gloved arm here playfully slices up Edenic knowledge apples, or maybe just onions or potatoes, with perfect bisecting cuts, neat divisions like the markers of the encyclopedia's pages, while the other arm leads on strings and wheels lines of tiny disposable toy infantry, cavalry, artillery, and perhaps indigenous troops, with one horse and horseman cut in half just as neatly as the apples, and handwritten lines of unreadable battle plans beneath them all. More modern paratroopers parachute into territory behind him, and balloons carry aloft the modern missile that suggests the age of imperialism is far from over, just as the legs, encased in what looks like late medieval plate armor, evoke its early roots. The officer's own chair has wheels, as if reducing as well to a constructed figure being puppeteered in imperial discourses. But the mobility and bloodlessness of the toy play here is undercut by the previous page's reminder of what the weapons are capable of. And one of the unreadable alien letters themselves. Okay, here, let me just raise that back up again for a second. Yeah, one of these unreadable alien letters, the individual symbols written out in the alphabet section by white hands, one of which has a fingernail doubling as a possibly weaponized pen, are designed to evoke vaguely westernized alphabet letters. One page spread even has an artist creating words in French. Maybe one reason the book letters are handwritten is to make more visible the agency, responsibility, and biases in constructing fantastic worlds or distorted mirrors of our own. Knowledge recording language is never neutral or transparent here. A magnifying glass reveals that the individual letters have environments and populations within them. A stream of fish, for example, at the top, curves of bare white bodies and sexual play, cars on a curving highway. One letter resembles a root, and on another page, another a green shoot with an insect on it, but nature or the fantasy of naturalized language origins is always culturally overwritten here. Another letter is simply the shape of a cage in which tiny birds are trapped. One word leaks blood. Like an image very reminiscent of William Burroughs's idea of language as an alien virus fostering hate and war. Ink drips from the mouth of another diner. Okay, here, let's go back up. Ink, you can see ink dripping from their mouth, forming letters on his napkin bib like trace patterns in a fever dream of capitalist consumption. Written representations of speech, indeed, become increasingly more violent. Words get extracted from mouths by devices that look like elaborate gags and torture devices. Whose voices are silenced or compelled in our text? Whose information gets recorded? The one non-white figure has speech written, you can see it here, over an oval of water, fluid rather than fixed, and all those marks are presumably lost when the water bubble bursts above his head. Okay, the invention of alien language in book art has long been a device for exploring human biases and the limits of knowledge. In Joanna Drucker and Brad Freeman's 1992 artist book, Other Space, an entity from or as the planet Mars contacts a human scientist, Jane, by sending her back the Martian alphabet constructed by the 19th, early 20th century Genevan medium Ellen Smith, whose seances also dabbled in past life narratives about Arab sheiks and Indian princes. In other words, terrestrial fantastic imaginations of others. The Martian letters then, instead of signifying an actual alien culture, simply reflect back humans colonizing constructions, like a version of the sentient ocean reflecting back the crew's violence, loss, and trauma in Lem's Solaris novel and Tarkovsky's film. In the Codex Seraphinianus, much has been made of a metafictional final page. We see the page itself scrolling up, the sheet scrolling up to reveal scattered authorial hand bones in a cell. But perhaps the question is not what's going on here, but what comes after it. If we de-articulate the book's skeletal epistemological structures, what's next? We might explore the penultimate architecture section for some possibilities. It's still undeniably full of rebooted Western cultural symbols and stories, from the Tower of Babel to Escher, Ernst, and Italo Calvino's Impossible Invisible Cities. But in a book haunted by imperial epistemology, it models messy knowledge structures that are broken, exposed, or circumventable. Labyrinths like this one built on a sea. Roofless homes. Half-constructed walls or dwellings of single walls like cardboard props, more open, rhizomatics, interpenetrated structures full of regular and irregular holes, more provisional than the finished machines in the invention section, slightly harder to classify in ways that defy the bounded text boxes and the solidly bound form of the conventional codex. Even closed-off buildings have cracks and unexpected entrances. Most of these buildings and cityscapes signally, I think, aren't inhabited yet, or have only a few vaguely outlined human silhouettes, lacking the earlier racialized signifiers, or are abandoned, like the tower here, ringed by the detritus of cast-off bottles and boxes, without things, in other words, that gave shape to earlier forms. Without crowds of humanoids, there's more space dedicated to geographic formations, weather, water, reflective surfaces mirroring the sky. Some building materials like this one seem fluidly poured over structures, or else it's the island that get beneath an indistinct cityscape that gets painted, not the city itself. Could these architectures themselves, just hints and glimpses, inspire less hierarchical information models within or beyond the codex? Sculptural, digital, internetworked, eco-poetic, biopoetic? Or what wholly different knowledge structures might a new generation of decolonial book artists invent? Forms that seem alien to our current models. That remains to be seen and disseminated. Okay, thank you. And